In part 2 of this tactical analysis of the UEFA Nations League final, we now take a look at how Spain set up in possession. As Spain's general setup, they have this 4-2-3-1 structure, but it changes the higher up the field they progress. Both fullbacks, Jordi Alba and Navas, are in positions to provide the width. However, we end up getting Alba being closer to Laporte than Navas gets to Lenormand, and this is because Navas has a more dynamic profile than Alba. But Alba has a better technical capacity, which is why he works closer to Laporte so that he can make quick, short, sharp passes and movements to escape pressure, which is why we see Spain lose the ball more often down the right-hand side than we do the left side during the build-up and mid-third phases. Moving on to the other players, Asensio will often be seen stretching as the highest and positioning himself on the inside channel alongside Morata, allowing Navas to have a clear outside channel. And finally, in the midfield, Rodri would often be seen as the deeper holding midfielder, with Fabian Ruiz having a similar role to Kovacic, where he can push higher and occupy the space between Croatia's midfield and defensive line. Now, looking at Spain's build-up, they struggled early on trying to build out once the ball got into wider positions, similar to Croatia. The difference with Croatia's press being just how aggressive their striker Kramaric was when dividing the field and pressing the supporting centre-back. Once Lenormand and Laporte identified that they had space to drive, that would be the cue for Kramaric to lock on, divide the field, and lock the driving centre-back to one side. Finally, when we see the ball travel to the full-back, Croatia's winger jumps to press, and the ball can't be played back to the centre-back because Kramaric is marking very tight, and the midfielders were man-marked. Here we see the example where Lenormand has driven across and taken the space, but Ivanusek blocks the early path to Gavi, so now is forced to play to Navas. Once Navas gets the ball, it's one big collective effort from the Croatian players to stick tight to their markers and force Navas into a long direct pass where they eventually regain possession. When Spain were able to progress through the first line of pressure, often through utilising Rodri to draw and release, and progress into the middle third, Croatia ensured that their distances were very compact between the lines to try and prevent Spain from playing through centrally. Defensively, they set up like a 4-5-1. However, Modric could be seen pushing higher alongside Kramaric to place pressure on Laporte and Jordi Alba if he was positioned closer to the centre-back. As a result of Modric pushing higher, the far side midfielder, usually Kovacic, would need to drop and tuck in alongside Brozovic to prevent players like Gavi and Morata from receiving the ball. Here is an example of Spain's mid-third structure, where the only major difference being the positioning of Rodri. When the centre-backs are comfortable, Ruiz would push higher, Navas providing the width on the other side with Asensio tucking in, and Pino as the highest and widest along the left-hand side. For Spain, there was a heavier emphasis on attacking down the left-hand side, with 60% of their attacks coming down that flank. However, unlike Croatia, Spain were able to find ways through central areas, with 32% of Spain's attack coming centrally. This left only 8% of the attack coming down the right-hand side. The other difference was that the average crossing position down the right side was higher than on the left-hand side for Spain. With this in mind, we'll look at the structural and functional differences through each channel. Down the left-hand side in the final third, you had both Yeremy Pino as the highest and widest, as well as Jordi Alba getting involved during the attacking phases. With the aim of crossing the ball into the box, this came through a different manner depending on the player. If Pino was on the ball, he was more likely to take on Croatia's fullback and drive as close to the box before playing in. However, having Erlich as the secondary support for Juranovic made it difficult for Pino to advance down the byline, so he would often find himself either losing the ball in an attacking duel or passing back to Jordi Alba, who would then be positioned in and around the top of the box to get across into Morata or Asensio as the targets. And here we see the example of Pino receiving the ball and taking on Juranovic, attempting to get as close to the box as he can before crossing in for Morata or Asensio. And in the second instance, him not being able to progress the ball, cutting back to Alba, who then has a cross from the top of the box to try and find Asensio and Morata again. So for the right side progression, both Asensio and Navas were the key players involved, but as previously mentioned, their average crossing positions were higher than the left-hand side. The first variation of looking to release Navas, Asensio would receive the ball off the switch of play, allowing him extra space than if the ball was just to be played directly down the right side. Once Asensio receives the ball, Navas then overlaps and attacks the space in behind for a cross once he is able to evade Perisic. The second variation would usually involve a supporting midfielder like Gavi, who ends up dropping deeper and receiving the ball off Normand, again from the switch of play. This engages Ivanusek, who would otherwise move out to mark Navas. Once Gavi played out wide to Navas, Perisic goes to press, leaving Asensio to run into that half space in behind for a low hard cross towards goal. However, once again, Spain were unable to create any real chances from these crosses due to the quality and accuracy of the crosses, as well as the numbers in the box at the time of the cross. Here we see the example of Asensio receiving the ball off the switch of play, which then becomes a cue for Navas to start to overlap and engage Perisic. So once he engages Perisic and creates the space he needs for himself, he then tries to cross the ball in. However, we can see that Morata's pretty heavily marked by Sotolo in this instance. There were occasions where Spain gained success by playing through centrally, and there were typically two elements which allowed this to happen. The first being the distances between Morata and the supporting players getting closer when Croatia were happy to sit off, which left opportunities for quick combinations. The second being if Croatia ended up stepping higher, as the ball travelled back, the distances between their midfield and defensive line grew larger. This allowed a split pass to be made to find players like Gavi, who can then drive at the back line and then create space for himself to take a shot. Thank you for listening to this tactical analysis. Let me know what you thought in the comments.